Hey everybody, I'm Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, and I'm so honored to be delivering this keynote address via live stream on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. It's one of my favorite days to celebrate for the students of UW-Stevens Point and now the entire UW system. I want to begin today by talking about what, under different circumstances, I would have talked about on such a momentous occasion. And that's the historical significance of Earth Day and the urgent need to focus on protecting our environment. However, the struggle against COVID-19 has expanded my thinking as it relates to the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. This public health emergency presents us with an extraordinarily complex and reflective call to action, which I'll get into a little bit more specifically in a moment. Some of my most fond and joyful memories in life have been in the outdoors, taking in nature's beauty. As a child, I had an opportunity to travel to some of our country's most beautiful spaces with my grandparents. Tucked away in their van, we crisscrossed the country during my summer breaks. From Yellowstone National Park to the Grand Canyon, I had a chance to witness breathtaking views. I saw nature in its finest form, and I slept beneath the stars and built a lifetime of memories with my grandparents. I'm so thankful that they gave me this opportunity. I'm also thankful that our Earth gave me this opportunity as well. And today, I'm honored to be here with all of you to celebrate our Earth. For 50 years, Earth Day has brought people together across the entire planet to enjoy the trees, our outdoor spaces, and to practice environmental stewardship. These values are core to Wisconsin's history and its future. But this year, celebrating Earth Day will clearly have to look a little bit different. Now, just last week, our administration made the difficult but necessary decision to extend the Safer at Home order because we know that we are beginning to flatten the curve here in Wisconsin. But that work and the sacrifices that people have already made, from students and faculty like you, all people who are adapting to virtual learning, we aren't going to have a normal commencement in our essential workers. They're on the front lines, risking their lives each and every day. And all the progress we've made can easily be undone if we try to reopen our economy in this state too quickly. We are fortunate, though, that amid so much uncertainty, that our Earth continues to provide us with daily solace. Solace in the form of fresh air that we can breathe from our porches and on our walks, and sunlight that brightens our homes and nourishes our plants. The beautiful natural spaces in our state can ease our minds and provide us with the land to physically and mentally care for our bodies. A few weeks ago, I was fortunate enough to visit Governor Nelson State Park, aptly named for Wisconsin's governor and U.S. Senator Gaylord Nelson, who founded Earth Day in 1970. I hiked through the woods and some time on the shores of Lake Mendota. It helped ease my mind. And it was evident that despite what's going on in the world, that nature is following her course with little disruption and forging towards new growth and new life. I'm reminded of this again while we're going to work in the state capitol as I notice the beautiful tulips planted each year on the Capitol grounds. They're starting to bud. Our Earth, it's a powerful being. And even during our darkest hours, she continues to shine light. But even if we forget the scourge of COVID-19 for just a moment, we have to reckon with the fact that planting trees one day a year isn't enough anymore. We can't just celebrate the Earth on days like this. We have to start talking about how we actually save the Earth for good. Because the next 50 years of Earth Day, they aren't promised. If we continue to disregard our environment, if we ignore the science and reality of climate change, and we continue to pollute our water and air, we may not have another 50 years before these natural resources we cherish cease to exist. Unfortunately, when Governor Evers and I came into office, our state was so far behind others in recognizing the harms of unsustainable practices and dealing with the impacts of climate change. In fact, we were going in the completely wrong direction, significantly rolling back environmental protections. But I'm proud that our administration is committed from day one to call out the reality of climate change. And that's why we continue to work each and every day to be champions for the environment and more sustainable policies in this state. And while we may not be able to celebrate Earth Day the way that we would have hoped, I encourage everyone to stay strong and to continue advocating for the planet and the people, because that's what we do here in Wisconsin. We take Earth Day seriously in our state, not just because it was founded by one of our heroes, but because Wisconsin has a rich history of conservation. People like Increase Lapham, who was known as Wisconsin's first great scientist. He published some of the first catalogs of plants and shells and one of the first books on the dangers of deforestation. People like John Muir, who co-founded the Sierra Club. He got his start in natural history and preservation in Wisconsin after his family immigrated here from Scotland. And Aldo Leopold, he wrote his famous book, The Sand County Almanac, which explored how humans can develop a more ethical relationship with the natural world around them. All this while he lived in Sauk County. These figures are important to our state's history, and their influence fundamentally shaped the environmental movement that we see today. But we have to remember, we have to also recognize that they were standing on the shoulders of indigenous communities because they've been the stewards of this land since time immemorial. You see, Increase Lapham wasn't necessarily Wisconsin's first great scientist because indigenous communities already understood the science of conservation and sustainability far before he came around and told us that deforestation was bad. Indigenous communities already had a respectful relationship with the natural world around them before Aldo Leopold even wrote his book about this idea. Wisconsin's indigenous communities, whose teachings and traditions are rooted in the notion that we must live in harmony with the earth, they were the first and foremost stewards of the land that we call Wisconsin. They have and they continue to be the bedrock of Wisconsin's environmental movement. Their wisdom and perspective on how to care for the earth and one another should serve as guiding principles for each and every one of us. And as Lieutenant Governor of Wisconsin, I've spent the past year seeing the unfortunate and even deadly impacts of the climate crisis. I've had a chance to travel to Lake Superior numerous times, and I had a chance to spend time with the Red Cliff Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, and Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission to learn about the effects that climate change is having on our most majestic Great Lake, the largest Great Lake. I visited farmers in central Wisconsin whose livelihoods have been destroyed by extreme weather, and I've also spent time in Monroe County learning about the horrific impacts that flooding has had on their communities. Unfortunately, our state isn't short on these stories. Last summer, the northern half of our state, including Portage County, experienced severe storms and flooding resulting in millions of dollars of damaged property, leaving so many unable to rebuild. And research shows that we're likely to keep seeing precipitation levels increase across the state, both extended dry periods and heavy periods of rain and flooding. The majestic Great Lakes that border our state are also under threat, along with the thousands of smaller lakes and rivers that stretch throughout our entire state. As these precious bodies of water grow warmer, we're seeing more algal blooms and other harmful bacteria develop. This throws off the ecology and it disrupts our wildlife. All of this is having a devastating impact on our natural resources, our state's economy, our agriculture, and our farming communities who are already struggling, and ultimately the health and well-being of every person in Wisconsin. And just a few blocks from my office at the state capitol building, there was an explosion last summer at a power plant. Fortunately, no one was injured, but homes and offices were evacuated, and 2 large fires raged throughout the day, demonstrating just how dangerous fossil fuels can be. These are just a few examples of why it's absolutely imperative to address the climate crisis right here at home and around the globe. But the way we address this crisis matters. In my role as a leader in the state, I see it as my responsibility to center marginalized communities as we discuss the importance of Earth Day, both for their contributions to our collective understanding of the importance of caring for our environment, our planet, and its resources, but also to draw attention to the harsh irony created by the intersection of deep-seated racism and environmental injustice, the vulnerabilities in our Black and brown communities and in low-income communities, and the significant racial disparities that we see in health, education, financial security, and overall well-being across the state of Wisconsin are a consequence of structural and systemic racism, and that's why it's imperative that environmental justice be the centerpiece of our movement for the next 50 years. To me, that means that those who've been disproportionately impacted by the consequences of climate change have to be at the center of our movement and must be a part of determining the solutions to these problems. The need for environmental justice is exceedingly obvious as of recent weeks in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Disproportionate numbers of Black and brown people in our communities are becoming infected, hospitalized, and losing their lives. Nearly half of all of our state's positive cases are concentrated in Milwaukee County alone, and over 1/3 of the deaths from COVID-19 have been Black Wisconsinites, despite only making up 6 to 7% of the state's population. And counter to the harmful belief that some people in our state unfortunately hold, these disproportionate impacts of the COVID-19 crisis aren't the consequence of individual habits or poor choices, but rather the result of centuries of policy decisions that have resulted in grave environmental injustice. Policy choices made not by the most impacted, but by those in power. These have systemic consequences for the marginalized among us. The policy choice of locating transportation hubs and interstate highways in certain communities and the resulting impact on air quality has contributed to higher rates of asthma, pneumonia, cardiovascular disease, respiratory issues, and compromised immune systems, the very factors that exacerbate the impacts of COVID-19, right in poor Black and brown communities. The policy choices of where you locate factories in certain industries have led to wildlife and waterways being poisoned with heavy metals and harsh chemicals. These contaminants have resulted in Ojibwe communities and other Native nations in northern Wisconsin suffering at a disproportionate risk of health problems from eating these fish, the deer, and other wildlife as dictated by their cultural traditions. We've also seen the issue of PFAS contamination in communities across Wisconsin, from Peshtigo and Marinette down here to Madison. This contamination has flowed into our waterways where Native, Black, and Latino and Hmong anglers are more likely to fish for substances, rather than just for sport, so that they will face the health consequences of eating these poisoned fish. These policy choices and inequitable urban planning practices are often built on NIMBYism, the toxic idea of not in my backyard. This allows more well-off and often homogenous communities to mobilize against undesirable development projects in their communities. This leaves low-income communities and communities of color who generally have the least ability to attend a public hearing or wield political influence to bear the brunt of these environmental hazards. The unmitigated and continuous harmful effects of the presence of lead in paint and pipes in poor and underserved communities, the presence of overcrowded and uncertain housing complexes for low-income families in geographic areas known as food deserts, they often lack the access to affordable, healthy food, and it's created a myriad of conditions making these populations more susceptible to contracting COVID-19 and also more likely to suffer increased severity from the infection. Apart from these examples in Wisconsin, current reports indicate that places like the Navajo Nation, Detroit, Houston, and Los Angeles have higher rates of death in poor neighborhoods of color with air pollution and environmental degradation than all the others. And meanwhile, the ability to practice physical distancing and to limit the spread of infection is also more difficult in higher density neighborhoods and in communities of color where multi-generational households are much more common. So these systemic environmental injustices that we're talking about have both made it harder to keep poor people and people of color from getting sick with COVID-19 on the front end, and it's also made it harder for people to get treated and to recover once they're diagnosed. We see a lose-lose scenario, and many of these people can do everything right, and they're still more likely to contract this virus and need serious medical attention because of all the structural and systemic issues that I've laid out. Thus, having safe, clean environment in which to live is in itself an immense privilege that hasn't been afforded to everyone. And now more than ever, as people seek the outdoors for clean air, space, and a break from the quarantine, one should acknowledge and reflect upon the fact that many of us have underestimated and taken for granted our easy access to city, county, and state parks. And now their value and the role they're playing in our collective lives is clear. And yet this access and these spaces are not afforded to everyone. All of this is to say that if we don't center environmental justice in this movement, our fight today for conservation and environmental protection, it won't meet the moment. If we keep coming up with a one-size-fits-all approach that leave out certain communities and ignore certain penalties and don't take on the systemic nature of this crisis, then we won't have another 50 years to figure out how to act. When we are inclusive, we build a stronger, longer-lasting movement. So how do we start centering environmental justice? We can start right here on this Earth Day, in the next 50 days, in the next 50 Earth Days, by not only acknowledging the dominant names, past and present, and advancing the environmental movement like those I mentioned before, and like global icons that we see like Greta Thunberg, but by expanding our perspective and recognition to honor those activists and leaders of color who've been in this struggle on behalf of their communities, but don't always get the same recognition. Activists like Mari Copeny, who at 8 years old, she wrote President Obama about the lead crisis facing her mostly Black community in Flint, Michigan. This led him to visit Flint and bring the issue to our nation's attention. Mari's now 12 years old, and she's continued her fight for clean water, starting the Wednesdays for Water campaign to raise awareness about areas in need of clean water. Other activists like Bruno Rodriguez, who at 19 has already led youth walkouts against government inaction and pollution from corporations in his home of Buenos Aires. And he's demanded that we not just listen to science, but we act on science. People like Autumn Peltier, who at 15 years old is an official water protector, fighting for universal access to clean water for her community. The Wickwamacong First Nation on Lake Huron, and for all of us who are privileged to call the Great Lakes region our home. Autumn has spoken at the United Nations numerous times and fought bravely against the expansion of pipelines in Canada. All of these young activists of color are leading the way to a better, more equitable, and a more sustainable world. But just as Autumn learned of the fight for clean water from her great aunt Josephine Mandela, an Ojibwe activist who walked the shores of all 5 Great Lakes to raise awareness for water conservation, we must all learn from the founders, champions, and torchbearers of the environmental movement, our indigenous communities across Wisconsin and across this nation. We have to acknowledge them not as tokens, because we're trying to be woke or trying to get points or attempts at diversifying environmental advocacy, but as the true champions and standard bearers of our state and nation's most valuable resources, as the original advocates for clean water, wilderness protection, and responsible and measured conservation. From the Menominee Nation's sustained yield techniques of harvesting timber while maintaining the longevity of the forest, to the work of tribes across the state to fight against sulfide mining that not only breaks federal treaty laws, but also harms the earth in countless ways for everyone, to the fight for water protection as demonstrated at Standing Rock in the fall of 2018. We owe it to the first stewards of this land to listen to them, to partner with them, and to follow their lead as we create a more sustainable state for all. And that's what our administration has been trying to do for the last year. We started by taking the initial step of rejoining the U.S. Climate Alliance and vowing to uphold the Paris Climate Agreement. Last year, Governor Evers signed Executive Order number 38 to set the ambitious goal of making sure that all electricity consumed in the state is 100% carbon-free by 2050. The order also created the Office of Sustainability and Clean Energy to oversee this work and to help create a statewide climate action plan. Then in October of last year, Governor Evers created the Task Force on Climate Change and entrusted me to be the chair as we collect guidance on combating climate change and transitioning Wisconsin to a more just and equitable clean economy. So far, we've been able to bring together people of diverse groups and diverse backgrounds representing Native nations, the business community, agriculture, utility companies, labor groups, and other industries and other communities from all corners of Wisconsin. Setting these goals and doing this work now isn't about feeling good or being on the right side of history. Although it does feel good to be on the right side of history, it's about preparing for our state's future and preparing for your future and the futures of the generations yet to come. If we want to create a state that is equitable and sustainable and truly a great place to live and work for everyone, we have to start by charting the path and meeting our clean energy goals and improving the environment. If we want to be a global leader in environmentalism, we need to diversify the resources used to meet the state's energy needs and create a green economy with family-supporting jobs. And if we want to ensure that we don't repeat the harms of the past and work towards undoing the harms of today, we must embed the teachings of environmental justice in our school curriculum. And we have to teach people the value of the land, the earth, and the contributions of every community at an early age. Now, you can probably tell that the issue of environmental justice and sustainability is incredibly important to me, based on the fact that I've spent the last 20 minutes or so talking to you about it. But this is important to me because I've lived through many of these inequities and injustices. The neighborhood that I grew up in, it was systemically starved of resources. I was a young person who grew up with asthma. It's my family, my friends, my neighbors who are suffering these adverse consequences. Nearly 11% of children tested were found to have lead poisoning in Milwaukee. This is a higher percentage than any other city in our state. And we already talked about the ways that COVID-19 is impacting Milwaukee residents. This is my fight because it's my community's fight. It's our state's fight. These systemic inequities that contribute to environmental justice are why I became a community organizer. The urgency of these problems are why I ran for state assembly back when I was 25 years old and why I ran for lieutenant governor the age of 31. But this can't just be my fight. It has to be your fight too. It has to be all of our fight. Otherwise, it won't just be certain communities in our state that aren't successful. Just like the impacts of climate change are reaching every community in our state, the impacts of injustice do as well. Our entire state's economy depends on a thriving and inclusive economy in our urban centers, just as it depends on a thriving economy in our more rural areas and everywhere else in between. If we don't remedy the racial inequities that exist, we lose out on the next generation of farmers, of scientists, of business leaders, and artists. We limit the people of our state. We limit the future of our state. So on this 50th anniversary of the Earth Day, I want you to celebrate our natural spaces and all that they provide to us. The Safer Home Order doesn't mean you can't go on a hike or bike around your neighborhood or just read a book on the porch. Just do so from the safe distance from others. But while you're breathing in fresh air or admiring the natural world around you, I also want you to think about what environmental justice might look like in your community. Also think about what it may look like in a community that's not yours. Because no matter what you look like, or where you're from, if we want to preserve our state's natural resources and beautiful outdoor spaces for the next 50 years of Earth Day, we need to start looking out for each other. We have to start incorporating equity and sustainability in everything that we do in our daily lives. So I want to thank you to the students and faculty across the entire UW system, and I hope you all have a safe, reflective, and celebratory Earth Day. Thanks so much, and I hope to see you soon.
And now the Lieutenant Governor will answer a few pre-submitted questions from the audience.
All right.
All right, first one here. Hello, Lieutenant Governor Barnes. I've heard about the fact that jobs will be created once the Green New Deal gets going, but I don't know what specific jobs the Democrats are referring to.
Yeah, so the Green New Deal is an idea that will certainly help out not just the state of Wisconsin, but the entire country a great deal. You look at the crisis that we're in right now, and now you look at the economic crisis that's been brought on by COVID-19. We are going to need real solutions for long-term sustainability. And when you ask about the jobs that could potentially be created, you can look at the jobs that have already been created. Jobs in renewable energy and clean energy sector are outpacing job growth in any other sector of the economy. It's already happening, and we have to take hold of that growth. We have to take hold of that momentum and see the moment that's in front of us right now. There are different degree and certificate programs in our technical schools that give opportunities to students to further their education while also creating a path for them to start a career. And that could be in solar, it could be in wind, it can also be in research and technology. The list goes on and on and on. The possibilities are limitless. And if you look at our public spaces, especially in a state like Wisconsin, where we have some beautiful architecture in all 72 counties, a lot of those buildings, they look incredible. You wouldn't tear them down for any reasons, but they can be somewhat inefficient. And that's an opportunity for us to look to retrofit these public buildings, to provide opportunities just to reshape what society looks like and what it could be. And we can make these buildings more efficient, providing jobs for folks all across Wisconsin. I like to think of the original New Deal and see how we can use those same techniques and apply them to the issues and the challenges that we face today. It's not much different.
All right. What do you see as a first step into creating a more green Wisconsin? What needs to be done?
So the first step in creating a green Wisconsin or a more green Wisconsin, I think we've already taken that step. The very first step is acknowledging that a problem exists. Prior to this administration coming in, the previous administration scrubbed the words climate change from states' websites. People weren't allowed to talk about the realities that we're dealing with. And the first step to solving any problem is admitting that one exists. So that is a significant first step. On election night, the very first words that came out of my mouth were, we're bringing science back. And letting science inform our decision making is going to help us out a great deal. So that's the first step, but I'll give you another one that we already took as well, and that is stating our goals, making sure that we are putting Wisconsin on a path, putting us on a trajectory to being 100% renewable, clean energy by 2050. It's an ambitious goal, but it's a goal that we have to take on. And it's one that if we work hard enough, we can beat the goal. And I think that should be our goal. Our goal should be to beat the goal.
Okay. Executive Order 52 created the Governor's Climate Change Task Force. It also stated that Wisconsin is committed to making sure that 100% of electricity in Wisconsin is carbon-free by the year 2050. What steps have been taken so far to work towards this goal, and what steps will be taken in the near future? Lastly, how can Wisconsin constituents get involved in supporting this measure?
Yep, so there is the Office of Clean Energy and Sustainability and Clean Energy that goes along with the task force. These two are going to work in tandem, and it starts by creating a clean energy plan for the state of Wisconsin. And we have a director for the office who's hard at work putting that together right now as we speak. But it's not just her. Just like it can't just be me, it can't just be you. It has to be a collective process. And with the Climate Change Task Force, we open that meeting up to the public, and we give opportunity for the public to comment, to make their voices heard, to talk about some of the challenges they've faced. And that's why we have them in different cities, or prior to the Safer Home Order, we had these meetings in different cities across the state. We've had 2 so far. And that means that people get a chance from all corners of Wisconsin to show up and make their voices heard. And comments can also be submitted online or by email, because again, this is a collective process, different challenges in different parts of Wisconsin. And with this office working together, I think the most important thing, not the office, but the task force, the most important thing is the diversity of industry. You have so many people who are represented on the task force from different walks of life, people who don't always get to have conversations with each other. And sometimes there are interests that agree and align, and there are sometimes interests that don't align. But the problem has been that even when those interests haven't aligned, they haven't necessarily had the chance to have a conversation with each other. And that's one of the bigger goals of the task force, is to have people who wouldn't necessarily be in the same room with each other, who have disagreements, giving them a space to talk about, why XYZ is important to them. And that is how we come up with the best solutions. And I think that, the goals that I stated before, getting us on the 100% plan by 2050, that's gonna take us a long way, but it won't just be what I think is right. It won't be just what the governor thinks is right. It's gonna be more carefully constructed with the input of the public and people who've been involved in this work for a really long time.
What are some themes that you see that can help both the urban and rural populations of our state get moving in the same direction in the years ahead to tackle the climate crisis?
So I think that I'll start by saying that, I try my best to not separate our urban and rural communities, because all of Wisconsin is dealing with significant challenges. And it does us very little good to separate communities and make people feel like their needs are different or more or less important than another's, because that's simply not the case. And I spoke in the speech about devastating weather patterns. Weather's going to happen regardless. However, we are seeing these 50-year, 100-year storms occur much more frequently than they have before. And that's a real problem, because communities are being ravaged, communities are being devastated. Understanding that there is something wrong, and while people may not always say that climate change is real, or may not even talk about climate change, they know that something different is happening. They know that the natural way of life has been disrupted for quite some time now, and something has to be done about it. And at that point, you open up the door to have conversations about the reality of the situation, which is climate change, which is the climate crisis that we're dealing with. And people start to listen, people start to understand, and also people begin to realize that no part of the state, despite the diversity, no part of the state is much different than the other, or no part of the state has priority over or under another part. And when you get to have those conversations and talk with people about challenges, and sometimes these are hard conversations, because these are people who lost so much in an instant and didn't expect it. And people have to literally rebuild their lives. And it's a shame and it's unfortunate that had to happen, that has to happen, or that it happens at all to people. But again, it gives us a chance to engage folks and get them to realize what's going on and talk about how we must do better. And it gives them an outlet to challenge elected officials, to challenge decision makers to do something about this, because we could have been doing so much more even before our administration came in. There could have been so much more that could have been done here in Wisconsin, but we've been stagnant for far too long. And that's why I encourage you all to reach out to your elected officials and ask why we aren't doing more. The governor put the 2050 goal in the state budget last year in 2019, but it was taken out of the state budget, so it had to be done by executive order. I don't think that was his intended route. We would have much rather had this have gone through the legislative process, but there were roadblocks in place, and I think those legislators should be challenged and asked why they've been inactive on the issue of climate change.
Okay, and last question. Some great legislation was enacted due to the collective action and voice of the first Earth Day. Now at year 50, what do you see as the most important collective action we can take in the next 50 years, next year, and now?
Yep, and I can go back to the speech, and I think that putting equity at the front, making sure that equity is hand in hand with sustainability, making sure that environmental justice is at the forefront for all communities. Again, this could relate, or this speaks to any community across the state of Wisconsin. Environmental justice. That is the overall goal for the next 50 years. For the next year, making sure that we come up with a very solid and bold set of recommendations from our task force to make sure that Wisconsin is well positioned to be a climate leader. We've been a climate leader before, but we've lost our ranking. And now I think it is an opportunity for us to once again reclaim that spot and become the envy of other states around us by leading with science. And I think this can be easily done, but it just takes the political will to make that happen. Political will is with this administration, but that political will has to be shared with everybody in state government.
Okay, and that wraps our questions.
Thank you.